Episode 2, The Impact of the First World War. Any and all information covered in this audiobook originated from the third chapter of the First Germany booklet. Between 1913 and 1918, the mark lost 75% of its value. Only 16% of the cost of the war had been met from taxation. By November of 1918, 2 million German soldiers had been killed, 6.3 million were wounded, and the war had cost Germany $8,394 million. Real earnings fell by 20 to 30%. Meat consumption fell to 12% of its pre-war level. In 1916, 1,000 people died from starvation and hypothermia. By 1918, this had risen to 293,000. Most Germans had supported Germany's entry into the Great War. An important exception was the radical wing of the SPD, and we'll talk about those more later. They bought into the ideology of encirclement, which made preemptive strikes seem like a reasonable way of conducting foreign policy. However, Germany ended up fighting a war on many fronts. Against Russia, France, the British Empire, and Italy on land, and against Britain at sea. While people expected new technologies, planes, cars, tanks, gas, machine guns, battleships, to mean a swift, decisive, dynamic war, they had the opposite effect. The war became staticone and one of attrition. In particular, the Royal Navy was exceptionally effective at blockading Germany, and by 1916-17, there were widespread food riots, strikes, and complaints on the home front in Germany. Furthermore, because the government of Germany was chosen by the Kaiser and not Parliament, there was no parliamentary accountability of government ministers. The blame was laid squarely at the door of the Kaiser and the political system. German losses in the war were staggering. About 13 of German men between 18 and 30 had died by 1918, and another 13 were maimed or crippled. About 1.9 million children were orphaned and 600,000 women widowed. This at a time when there was very little state provision of housing or welfare. The German political system was slow to respond to this crisis because German military strategists could not accept that Prussian military might was not supreme or that encirclement was a fantasy. The Junkers and the Kaiser could not relinquish direct control of the campaign. There was a first attempt at reform in 1917 when the aristocratic Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg resigned and the first non-aristocratic Chancellor George Michaelis took office. However, Junker generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg retained power behind the scenes. At the same time, the Reichstag voted to accept a proposition from the Zentrum to end the war and retreat to Germany's pre-existing borders. It was supported by the SPD and the left liberals, but not the nationalist liberals and conservatives. Michaelis tried to broker a consensus. However, also in 1917, the Navy began unrestricted submarine warfare, whereby they would attack all shipping suspected of supplying Britain and France. This action meant that American ships were sunk, bringing them into the war in the same year. However, the military dictatorship of Ludendorff and Hindenburg forced Michaelis to plan for 10 more years of war in public, while saying something very different in private: German victory and the annexation of much of Romania. By October 1917, the country was paralyzed by naval mutinies in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, strikes and starvation. In fact, Ludendorff in particular knew that Germany was, effectively, either defeated already in 1917 or about to be defeated. However, he believed that the way to get an advantageous peace was with a peace offensive. In particular, Ludendorff insisted on tying up over 1 million German troops on the Eastern Front to occupy territory taken from revolutionary Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, negotiated in autumn-winter 1917. In this crisis, the Kaiser appointed the first-ever party political chancellor, Prime Minister Georg von Hertling of the Zentrum, former minister-president, First Minister of Bavaria. An important principle had been conceded: ministers should be accountable to the Reichstag, not the Kaiser. But the army command took more power for itself, making civilian government increasingly irrelevant. A key success of the army command under Ludendorff and Hindenburg had been to make the civilian government, and indeed ordinary Germans on the home front, look like it was they who were responsible for Germany's catastrophic condition. The army command promoted a myth that it was civilians in government, on streets, in factories, on farms. Catholics, socialists, Jews, workers, women. That caused the collapse of Germany in 1918, rather than their conservative, Protestant junker militaristic strategies and fantasies. This is deeply significant, this Dolchstoßlegende, stab-in-the-back myth, because a large part of the German population believed it.